I can't think of a more appropriate place to interview you, Congressman Ryan, regarding the proposed budget than the Congressional Budget Committee's conference room here at Cannon, across the street from the Capitol building here in Washington, D.C. I'd like to start by thanking you for granting us this interview.
Sure.
It's a coveted opportunity that I was just told thousands of people are trying to get interviews with you.
Well, my pleasure.
The Corporate Business Solutions, Global Resources, Strategic Tax Advisors, GPS, as well as other competing and collaborative firms have all came together and made this magazine to represent that demographic and to try and give them information that would be useful. We all unanimously agreed that you would be the greatest interview if we could get it.
Oh, no pressure.
You have been described as brilliant, the nation's accountant, and other acclamations per both sides of the political aisle. Where did you acquire your accounting acumen?
Economics, actually. My life's ambition when I was younger was to become an economist. I wanted to go to the University of Chicago, get my doctorate, go into the field of economics. I decided, I went from undergrad, which was in economics, to take a temporary position as a staff economic researcher here in the Senate, on the other side of the Capitol, and then I ended up working for Jack Kemp as his staff economics staffer and a speechwriter. And I just got involved in public economics and public policy. And so I've always had a love for economics. I've literally been reading the federal budget since I've been 22 years old. So it's kind of a sick thing to admit, I know. So it's just been something I've been deeply interested in and involved in ever since I got out of school.
You recall metrics like you have a photographic memory. Do you have a photographic memory?
Numbers, I'm pretty good at remembering numbers and things like that. It's an area that I spend I dedicate a lot of my mind to, and it's an aptitude I have, and I enjoy it.
How would you rate Congress and the executive's branch at their understanding of GAAP? And do you think that it contributes at all to some of the difficulties we're having?
Trick question, I think. Yeah. The way government does accounting, it's not like anything else. If any company actually did their books like Washington does, forget about Sarbanes-Oxley. He'd be in jail a long time ago. So it's a very complicated system. The way the government accounting system works is different than most other systems. And not a lot of people around Washington really understand how it works. I would argue that it's a system was basically written in 1974 and was designed to kind of grow government, to keep spending, to have an inherent bias in favor of more spending and more taxes. And it makes it easier to borrow. It makes it easier to debt finance versus any other method of financing.
Well, if I expand on that, in business, you determine break even where gross profit overtakes fixed costs.
Yeah.
In government, how do they do that with?
Yeah, we don't have EBITDA in the federal government or anything like that. The problem with the government is A, we can print our own money. B, we're the world's reserve currency, so we can borrow a lot of money. And C, politicians run the place. Okay, what does that mean? That means most people around here, and this is from both political parties, have done well politically by making a lot of empty promises to voters. It doesn't profit politically to take something away from people, to be candid about the true nature of our fiscal problem and what it's going to take to fix these things. And so politics is typically rewarded the politician who makes the empty promise and is penalized the political leader who tries to fix problems or speaks candidly with voters about what they can or cannot have.
You're actually creating a nice segue from accounting to economics. And I'm wondering if there's a weakness there again in Congress or the executive branch, and if that's part of the problem with balancing inflation risks to recession risks.
Yeah, it is. I guess the way I would look at the way our economic policy, our fiscal policy, and our monetary policy is going is it's sort of almost a systematic replacement of the rule of law with the rule of men. Now that's more of a philosophical, political thing to say. But what we're doing is we are basically taking monetary policy and fiscal policy and we are off the moors. We are deviating from any standards of acceptable behavior. Monetary policy is excessively discretionary. And that keeps markets guessing as to what our currency is going to look like, what is our money going to look like as a reliable store of value, and therefore what are our inflation rates going to look like, what are our interest rates going to look like. Our fiscal policy, we're borrowing way beyond our means, We're spending money we don't have. 42 cents on every dollar is borrowed. 47% of that is borrowed from other countries. And so we're in a situation where our fiscal policy is on this massive collision course with our monetary policy. And at the end of the day, if we don't get this set, monetization is going to be the least worst option. And that's a big mistake. So what I see is massive uncertainty being injected into the economy because of government activism or government's lack of adhering to core standards or principles.
Do you perceive any potential for stalling any benefit that we got from the stimulus by constricting spending in order to get the...
Do I see benefit from that?
No, do you see a risk?
Oh, no.
Okay.
I'm not a Keynesian, so I don't subscribe to the demand side school of thought.
Okay.
So I do not believe, actually, I would take the contrary vision. If we actually cut real spending and got spending under control, I think that would be a good thing for our economy. It'd be a good thing for the credit markets. It'd help us stabilize interest rates. It'd take pressure off monetary policy. Because let's remember, every big deficit we run today simply translates into higher taxes or interest rates tomorrow.
Setting up the next question perfectly. How grave an indicator is the degradation of Standard & Poor's bond rating for us?
And if you read the Standard & Poor's downgrade or warning, it was really about political leadership. It wasn't as much of an accounting statement as it was, Washington's so messed up and it doesn't look like they're going to get anything fixed. So we're changing, we're warning against a downgrade from from stable to negative. And they basically made that conclusion based upon the fact that our fiscal authorities are not doing their job in getting things under control.
Predictive debt risk?
Yeah, so we do have debt risk. I think everybody who we talk to in the bond markets, talk to a lot of authorities in the bond markets, a lot of economists, they all tell us we have about 2 to 5 years, closer to 2, less close to 5. And so that scares me quite a bit, quite frankly. And this is why we're putting the budget out we put out. This is why, at the end of the day, we have to look ourselves in the mirrors. We have to look our children in the eye, our constituents, and we want to be on the right side of history. And we see a debt crisis coming. And our goal and hope is to try and preempt and prevent a debt crisis. So we don't have European austerity, which is what you'll have to impose in the midst of a debt crisis, where the rule is reserve currency. So I think the volatility would be even greater than what other sovereigns are facing. And the problem we have is, I would say, ideology and politics is making it impossible or very difficult right now of making a substantial achievement on getting our fiscal policy under control.
Well, do you see a shared culpability between both parties?
Yes, absolutely. Both parties are to blame for this. And look, let's stop trying to point fingers. I think we should just fess up to the fact that both political parties have screwed this up. So let's get that behind us and go try and fix this problem. And that's why we put out a budget that, according to the Congressional Budget Office, actually pays off the national debt. I mean, not only does it get to balance, which takes time, it pays off the debt.
Well, if you were going to weight on a 1 to 10 the willingness of members of Congress to put at risk their futures, to sacrifice the potential for re-election in order to do what's best for the nation, where do you think that would fall?
I mean, this is where I might get a little partisan. I think Republicans are there, especially in the House. And I think the big reason is we just got 87 new people, freshmen congressmen and women, who came here not for political careers but for causes. The last Republican majority, the one we had before 2006, was what I call mostly beers, not doers. People who were more worried about political careers than about America, about the next generation. They were worried about the next election, not the next generation. I think this caucus, by virtue of the fact that we just passed very comprehensive Medicare reform in our budget, $6.2 trillion in spending cuts. Let me give you an example. Dennis Hastert, who was the former speaker, he and I had dinner 2 years ago. He told me the hardest thing he had to pass during his whole 8 years of speaker in the earlier part of this decade was what we called the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005. That cut $40 billion over 5 years. He said it was the hardest bill he ever had to pass in his 8 years as Republican speaker. We just passed a bill easily with all but 4 Republican votes, cutting $6.2 trillion over 10 years. So I think where our party, I'm very pleased about this, and I think the Tea Party was a big help to this. We have gotten to the point where we see the fiscal cliff ahead of us. We realize this is not about careers, this is about the American idea, American exceptionalism. And we're putting ideas out there. Now we're getting savaged and demagogued by the left. We've got TV ads and all these things. And so I think the president and his party had made a decision not to negotiate and compromise with us on these big problems, but to use them as a political weapon against us in the next election. And that unfortunately means I think we're going to go and fight most of this out over 2012.
If I could extrapolate a little bit on that, how would you define political braveness versus political foolishness?
I think political braveness is looking people in the eyes and tell them what's going on with the federal government, the finances, how Medicare is going bankrupt, how our debt is unsustainable, and what are the things, and putting out actual ideas, actual budgets, actual plans to prevent a debt crisis, to cut the spending, to cap the spending, to reform government programs, and to put in place economic growth policies to get the economy growing. One thing I don't want to miss is this is not just a green eye shade experiment of math and accounting. It's not just cutting and controlling spending. You have to have economic growth. You got to have job creation. So a cornerstone of our economic plan and our budget are policies aimed at pro-growth policies to get the economy growing. Spending cuts and reforms and economic growth are the two things we're trying to achieve. So that, to me, is the key ingredient. We believe we owe it to the public, to our constituents, to give them specifics and basically try and win this argument and get the country to understand where we are. We see that as leadership, not just foolishness, not naivete. What we expected is what we're getting, and that is a torrent of negative ads trying to scare seniors and things like that to try and influence the next election. But if we allow that to continue and to happen and to succeed and to deter us, then we will have lost the next generation as far as I'm concerned.
You know, both you and Governor Walker display your mavericks, bold. I'm wondering if that you both grew up in Wisconsin.
Yeah, we grew up about 15 miles apart from each other. Yeah,
I know,
right.
It's amazing. You're both about the same age, kind of came up in the Reagan era. Do you think that's what contributes to this common boldness that you have?
Yeah, the Reagan era, I've had mentors. I lost my dad when I was young, so I've always had mentors throughout my life, and the mentors I've had were sort of bold leadership types. Jack Kemp was my big political mentor, along with Bill Bennett. I worked for them for a number of years. And we did grow up in the Reagan era, and that was sort of the model leader that we saw growing up. And so, yeah, I guess you could say that. And I think Scott would agree with that. Scott and I know each other extremely well, and I think he would agree with basically that idea.
Well, how has the enormity of being catapulted into the spotlight affected you and your family?
Actually, my family's quite fine. Look, my wife and my family, we have little kids. They're 6, 7, and 9 years old. My wife knows this is what I do, what I'm wired for. I feel like I'm wired for this moment. It's sort of my DNA. I've been looking at this problem, thinking about this problem, putting bills out for years. I put out the first Roadmap for America's Future, a bill to pay off the debt, get the economy growing, reform our entitlements in 2008. I had like 8 co-sponsors. 2010, I put out a similar legislation. I had 13 co-sponsors. This year, we wrote a budget accomplishing the same goals and missions of those roadmaps, and we got 239 votes, I think, for it, something like that. We all but 4 Republicans. It's now the Republican budget. So I really feel that we've dramatically moved and shifted this debate, at least among our party, to being the party that's serious about tackling this debt threat and reforming these entitlement programs while we can do it on our terms before they implode and getting this economy growing.
And you have to know, I've got to get around to asking you, how much pressure are you under to run for a higher office, and has that pressure increased since Huckabee and Trump? And
it increased mostly since Mitch Daniels didn't run. Mitch and I are kind of kindred souls, and so I think the people who are supporting him are kind of calling me these days. You know, it's never something I envisioned doing. I've always seen myself as more of a policy wonk, not a political person. Obviously, I'm a politician, so clearly I'm a political person. But that's not why I decided to do this. I wanted to get engaged in the battle of ideas in public policy. And so it's not a pathway I'd ever had mapped out in my mind. So
what would it take to get you to reconsider?
Oh, gosh, you know, I don't know the answer to that question. What I get, though, is that people are really hungry for honest, sincere, actual leadership. And we're not getting that right now. And people know that the economy, the country, the American idea is really up for grabs. And I fundamentally believe that. I think the entire American idea, equal opportunity, economic growth, prosperity, upward mobility, those characteristics are being jeopardized because of our economic policy today.
Well, another person that I've had sit-downs with, actually multiple sit-downs in his home in Beverly Hills, is Ben Stein. And he's a good guy.
Yeah, I've met him.
He's a good man. He's reluctantly said that he doesn't see any way out of the deficit without increasing taxes on the wealthy. How do you feel about that? Do you think that
I don't. I mean, his dad was
an economist?
yeah, no, I read those textbooks. And I think that's probably the school of thought he perhaps comes from. I don't really know him well. I'm not going to say what he thinks. Here's the problem. Let's just assume we do this. Let's assume we take the president's argument that we should tax the wealthy, which are people in his definition making above $200,000 or couples above $250,000, including all small businesses. If we take 100% tax from that income group, it'd fund the government through the middle of July. If we took all the profits of all Fortune 500 companies, it'd run our government for like 40 days. 10 years of the tax increases in the top two rate brackets that the president's calling for, 10 years of that revenue would simply help us pay off the deficit by half just this year. The point is, there's not enough money there to tax, and if you try, in my opinion, you'll hurt growth in the economy. This is not the 20th century anymore. America is not the undisputed economic superpower of the world. We have to compete, meaning we have to be competitive. And when we tax our businesses a whole lot more than our foreign competitors are taxing theirs, they win and we lose. And unfortunately, that is the way our tax system works today. So I worry that we're entering in a new political era, led by President Obama, of class warfare, of envy economics, of kind of pitting people against each other, of actually disparaging success and risk-taking entrepreneurship and achievement and production. That, to me, is not only bad from a moral standpoint, from a social cohesion standpoint, but it's really bad economics. And so I believe we have to have more fundamental tax reform. And Ben Stein's notion, lowering tax rates in exchange for broadening the tax base means less tax shelters for people to park their income into, but in exchange for lower tax rates across the board for everybody, so we have a more competitive tax system that is more globally competitive.
What would you do to limit or slow the migration of domestic business to overseas?
I would go to a territorial tax system. I'll tell you what we do in our budget. We say top tax rate in America is 25% for corporations or individuals. As you know, we have all the pass-through entities, sub-S's and partnerships and LLCs that are on the individual side. So what the Republican passed budget says is bring those tax rates down to 25%. On the corporate side, which I think is part of what you're alluding to, is I would go to a territorial tax system. I think we're really shooting ourselves in the foot the way we tax ourselves. The rest of the world has moved toward a territorial system. We're not. I just met with the Chief of Staff to the Council of Exchequer in Britain, who says not only do they just move to a territorial system, they're moving their top tax rate on businesses down to 23%. Ireland's at 12.5%. The international average corporate tax rate is 25%. We are at the highest now, 35%. So we are literally pushing capital overseas. And if a U.S. company makes capital overseas, we're locking it up overseas and making it impossible to come back. And so what is that doing? That's giving an incentive to keep capital overseas, not to domicile your company here. And we're making ourselves riper takeover targets of foreign companies taking over U.S. companies, which if that continues to happen at this alarming pace that it is, the loyalties of these corporations leave as well. So I really think we need to have a tax system that makes America a haven for capital formation. Let's make this country a tax shelter instead of other countries. And we can do that, still raise sufficient revenue for the government. And the way we look at increasing revenues to the government is not class warfare or a beggar thy neighbor tax increase approach. It is economic growth, job creation, better economic growth policies to raise revenue through higher growth, meaning lower tax rates at a broader base of income brings in more revenues and helps us close our fiscal gap.
You know, it seemed years ago there was some benefit for having a balance between conservatism and liberalism, kind of a yin and yang.
Yeah.
It seems to have been replaced with mean-spiritedness. Do you see that getting in the way of fiscal sanity?
Yes, I do. It's bitter partisanship these days. It's kind of character assassination. It's sort of Alinskyite now. It's I think what's happening is the kind of hope and change sort of mantra we heard before, and I'm not trying to just pick on the president here, but it's being replaced with class warfare, with preying on emotions of fear, envy, and anxiety, which there's a lot of that in America today, and trying to profit off of that, to me, divides people, speaks to worser qualities in people, when we should be focusing on growth, on opportunity, on upward mobility, on job creation, economic growth. And So I look at life glass half full from more of a happy warrior optimistic standpoint. And I think that that's unifying. I think that that's good for growth. I think that's good for society. And as I always say in our budget, let's focus our government's support on people who need it the most, the poor, the elderly, the sick, and not on people who need it the least, corporations, wealthier people. Let's go after corporate welfare. Let's stop picking winners and losers in the marketplace. Let's stop setting up large federal regulatory agencies that are micromanaging businesses. So one of the things we keep talking about is getting back to the 4 foundations of economic growth. Stable, predictable regulations that aren't putting crony capitalism in the system. Low and predictable tax rates. Sound money, so our money has a reliable store of value so we don't have an inflation problem. And get the spending under control so we don't have a debt crisis. Those are the basic sort of macroeconomic fundamentals we think need to come in place. And I would argue that government's going in the wrong direction in all of these, and it's doing it through the guise of class warfare and growing government in its reach into the private economy.
Speaking of warfare.
It took me a lot. I know that's a long answer to your question, but it's
it was good.
Important issues.
No, it was good. I agree. You know, there's been some controversy over the Medicare voucher program and the block grants. Mm-hmm. What I'm wondering, if you could explain why you think it's better than a single-payer program. Well, how are they different?
So they're polar opposites. A single-payer program is the government is the payer and runs all of the healthcare system, meaning the federal government decides how healthcare works, how healthcare is to be reimbursed. They decide how insurance works, what kind of medicine physicians can practice. They decide all the kinds of funding formulas. To me, it's a fatal conceit. Wherever this has been tried, it doesn't work. What ends up happening is you have to impose global budgets, because if something's a free good, society will continue to consume it and overutilize it because there's no connection between the seller and the buyer. And what happens is you have to ration care, have long waiting lines. What we propose is patient-centered healthcare. So specifically, what we're saying is let's do this in sort of a gradual, sensible way. No changes on Medicare for anybody who's above the age of 55. And we believe we can cash flow that commitment, the promise the government made to these people who've already retired and organized their lives around this commitment. We believe we can do that if we reform it for my generation, those of us 54 and below. And the way we choose to reform it is a way that has been had bipartisan support in years past. It's the kind of system President Clinton's Medicare Commission recommended, called premium support. Medicare gives a list of guaranteed coverage options, pre-approved plans from Medicare that are private plans competing against each other for the senior's business. And then we subsidize the person's plan based on who they are. If they're wealthy, they don't get as much of a subsidy than if they're low, middle income. And if they're sick or low income, they get a much higher subsidy. Doing it this way helps have choice and competition. It puts the senior, the beneficiary, in charge instead of the government.
Why do you think they represent it as pushing old people off of cliffs?
Yeah, there's actually an ad that shows me pushing an elderly woman off a cliff. That's what we call Medicare. It's political tactics aimed at trying to scare and intimidate seniors, distort it to try and profit politically in an election.
Well, how likely do you think?
I probably didn't even affect a person 55 and above.
I think it had the reverse effect anyway.
Yeah.
How likely is the outcome of Obamacare to become a single-payer system? I
think it's designed to become a single-payer system. That was the design of the law. So Obamacare and Medicare puts a panel of 15 bureaucrats who are unelected and unaccountable in charge of Medicare next year. They don't go through Congress. They just impose price controls directly. So that more directly puts the government in charge of how the system works.
Do you think it's sustainable?
No, I think it's going to collapse under its own weight. I think it's unsustainable. The Medicare actuary just told us, even with all of that, insolvency is moved up 5 years. They think 40% of Medicare providers will go out of business or stop taking Medicare. For the under 65 population, for your members who are watching this, the goal is this. If you don't give exactly the kind of insurance that Obamacare says you must to your employees, you got to pay a $3,000 fine per employee. But if you drop health care to your employees, put your people in the government exchange, you only have to pay $2,000 per employee. What do you think the incentive structure of that is? And then the other point is, when people are in the federal exchange, getting federally regulated and run health insurance, they will reimburse providers at a lower rate, which will overcharge the private payers who have to, through employer-sponsored health insurance, offer the exact kind of insurance that people get in the exchange which will be reimbursing providers at lower rates, meaning more expensive insurance for the private payers, the companies offering it to their employees if they keep doing it. Wash your hands of it, put everybody in the exchange, it's only $2,000 per person indexed at inflation. So the whole idea here is to get companies to dump their people in the exchange, and in the government exchange are 3 kinds of insurance you can have. They call it gold, silver, and bronze. It's basically, you're going to have 5 or 6 private insurance companies left. According to the insurers, they're telling us this, giving sort of Medicaid-like coverage, and they will basically be public utilities regulated by the federal government, which even if those sustain themselves, they're really single payer. If those go away, they'll put a public option in place, which was the original plan, to have the government be the actual payer of health care.
You were awesome. You were great. I just want to thank you very much for the interview, and I hope you get an opportunity to get this message out there.
Yeah.
It's really